Oh, they're meeting? Okay, yeah. So maybe if people are outside waiting to come in, they should come in. Otherwise, we'll close the doors and no worries. All right. Thanks very much for making time at the end of the conference to come to this session. My name's Winifred Lewis, for those that don't know me, and this panel is about the research of our team, mostly social psychologists from a variety of different interest backgrounds. So I'll be introducing the speakers very briefly, Charlie Pittaway, Susilo, Wibisono, Emma Thomas. Each of them will be presenting very different research methodologies, and then I will have just a couple of closing words before we go to the question period. Our first speaker is a brilliant PhD student, Charlie Pittaway, who will be available for other job opportunities in just a few short months. Charlie's work looks at environmental activism and the role of future orientation. But in this research, they present unrelated topic in terms of the DV, but a very interesting related topic in terms of the IVs, a cross-sectional and longitudinal analysis of social, political, and temporal predictors of support for democracy and political violence in Queenslanders. Please welcome Charlie.
Thanks very much, Winifred, and thanks everyone. I'm Charlie in my final year of my PhD, and yeah, really excited to talk to you today about the second wave of research we've done looking at support for political violence and related attitudes in Queenslanders. And we presented on the first wave of this data last year at Overt, but I will sort of briefly recap that research before integrating with our Wave 2 findings. So the sort of overarching question that we were asking with this line of research was like, what might lead Queenslanders to accept the use of political violence as a tool? As more and more Australians are embracing extreme ideologies and more protests and demonstrations are increasingly escalating to violence, it's really interesting to us like why and how this might happen and the kinds of people who might be more susceptible to this. So some things that we already know lead people to accept political violence include things like perceptions that democracy is ineffective or illegitimate, which can lead people to feel distrustful towards democratic systems. And this can also lead people to endorse authoritarian ideals, which we know are in turn also associated with acceptance of political violence. And we also know that certain groups of people are more likely to hold these types of attitudes than others. As we've seen across the last few days, young people, men, and people with really conservative political views tend to be more likely to be disengaged and dissatisfied with democracy, are more likely to vote for radical authoritarian populist parties, and are also more likely to endorse the use of political violence. And as we showed last year at Overt, present-oriented people, people who are more focused on the present compared to the future, are also more likely to endorse the use of political violence. Present orientation is one facet of this variable called temporal orientation, which is essentially how people think about and prioritize the present and the future in their day-to-day lives. So present-oriented individuals place really high value on the present, and they value immediate gratification. These people also tend to be more impulsive, as you might sort of assume, and they're also more conservative, and they show higher rates of interpersonal and intergroup violence and aggression. And the theorization behind this is thought to be that present-oriented people are pretty bad at thinking about and caring about the potential future consequences of behavior. And so because of this, we theorized that present-oriented people would be more likely to report supporting authoritarian ideals and more likely to report supporting political violence because they might be less good at conceptualizing and caring about the long-term consequences of these things. And we did, in fact, show that in last year's waves. On the flip side, we have future-oriented individuals, and these are people who place really high value on the possible distant future consequences of their actions, and they're much more likely to be willing to sacrifice present desires in the interests of achieving distant future goals. They're better at abstract thinking, they're more moral, and they're more politically engaged. And long-term thinking is thought to reduce intergroup conflict and promote belief in the possibility of peaceful conflict resolution. And as we showed last year, future orientation is associated with democratic ideals like support for free elections and belief in the importance of democracy. Now, our research specifically investigates these attitudes within Queenslanders. And Queensland is unique for a bunch of different reasons, especially in comparison to some of our neighbours on the East Coast further down. But some of these include having a reputation for being really conservative and change resistant compared to other states. And additionally, we have a really decentralized population in Queensland, which can breed a sense of regionalism and create a sort of us versus them mentality where people in the regional and rural towns in Queensland feel really neglected by their governments in cities, can feel a lot of distrust towards them. And then, of course, these regional grievances can really easily be exploited by populist politicians and other political parties as well. So we asked what social and temporal characteristics might be associated with more pro-violence attitudes in Queenslanders, and what would the consistency be with predictors of these other related attitudes, like support for democratic ideals and support for authoritarian ideals. And we additionally wanted to explore both the linear relationships as well as the non-linear relationships using a combination of different statistical approaches that might allow us to determine not just what's happening sort of like in the pooled sample and the average population, but what might be happening for these special little pockets of people who don't look the same as the average population. And I see now that I have accidentally deleted my slide with a little bit more information about the methodology, but essentially we had tested this with 2 waves of an ongoing longitudinal research project, and each wave had about 1,000 participants each. And at a descriptive level, we can see that the means for our democratic ideals were pretty high across both of our waves, right? So that's ideal. And generally, the support for the perceived justifiability of these 3 kinds of political violence that we tested were also pretty low across the board. Again, ideal. But what really surprised us was this sort of unexpectedly high averages for support for authoritarian ideals in both waves. And so you can see here, we only had 1 item that was measured on a 4-point scale, but both of these 2 items, the means are either at or rapidly approaching the midpoint for both of these items, which we weren't really expecting to find, right? And although these descriptors really show us that while there might not be this latent support for political violence in Queensland, this could be an area that we want to keep an eye on, considering some of the context for those types of related attitudes might be sort of ripe, I guess. And we also wanted to have a quick look at whether or not these attitudes differed depending on where people were located in Queensland. But we found no difference for people who lived in cities versus regional and rural towns across either wave. And to summarize the consistent linear results across the 2 waves, we consistently found that, older age and lower political conservatism were associated with support for our democratic ideals. And conversely, younger age and higher political conservatism was associated with more support for authoritarian ideals and political violence. And then controlling for these relationships, we again found that higher future orientation was associated with more support for democratic ideals, and higher present orientation was associated with more support for authoritarian ideals and political violence, all three kinds of political violence. And so this really does seem to suggest that present-oriented people might be worse at conceptualizing the consequences of authoritarianism or undemocratic ideals in general and the use of violent political engagement. However, we did also have quite a few inconsistent results across waves. So gender was inconsistently associated with some of our attitudes, both within and across waves. Same with unemployment and studying that did not consistently predict any attitudes across or within waves. Same with wealth perceptions and religious affiliation. And so this really does seem to suggest that demographic and social characteristics alone are not really good predictors of vulnerability to violent extremism without any additional information. But perhaps most unexpectedly, we found that future orientation was positively associated with both democratic and authoritarian ideals in Wave 2. And this really seems to challenge our sort of previous idea that future orientation might protect against some of these things, right? And it really highlights the multidimensionality of future orientation. And, when we're thinking about why this was happening, maybe we can interpret it as this idea, that future-oriented individuals might hold these attitudes because they're viewed as solutions with immediate outcomes, whereas future-oriented people might be persuaded to these types of approaches because they might see them as a path to a more secure future. Moving right along. So we also looked at a small subset of participants who were tested at both waves of our survey. And we wanted to have a look to explore the stability of the variables over 1 year. And there was considerable stability in all of these variables except for present orientation and support for police violence against protesters. So present orientation decreased on average from time 1 to time 2, a 1 year period, and support for police violence against protesters increased. And then the second thing that we wanted to do with this longitudinal sample was we wanted to explore whether any changes in our social or temporal characteristics from time 1 to time 2 were also associated with changes in any of our political attitudes. And what we found is that changes in present orientation were associated with changes in one of our democratic ideals. So as present orientation decreases, support for free election increases. And we also found that moving from urban settings to regional or rural towns, and then taking up an unpaid labor role, like becoming a stay-at-home parent, for example, were associated with decreases in support for strongman leadership. And then the final set of analyses that I want to really quickly walk through are our non-linear person-centered analyses. So Matteo, if you went to Matteo's talk yesterday, gave a really great overview of what latent profile analysis is, but basically it groups similar people into profiles based on a pattern of responses to a series of indicator variables. And this allows us to identify whether there are any little pockets of people who might have sort of similar characteristics. And in our Wave 1 sample, we found 5 profiles, and they were just characterized by age and temporal orientation primarily. So we had 2 younger profiles, differentiated by being present-oriented or future-oriented, 2 older profiles, again, 1 present-oriented and 1 future-oriented, and then a middle-aged present-oriented profile. And then when we looked at how these profiles were associated with our political attitudes, we could see that there was something really special about being both young and present-oriented. So it was really only this group that had particularly low support for democracy and particularly high support for authoritarian ideals and political violence compared to the sample mean. And this led us at the end of last year's talk to sort of say that this is a profile that we should be focusing on, right? This might be a sort of group of people in the population that are quite unique. But then when we ran the profile analysis on Wave 2, the profiles looked completely different. We only had 2 profiles in this sample, and they were not characterized primarily in terms of age and future and temporal orientation. They were primarily distinguishable on education and wealth. So we had a lower education, low wealth group, and a higher education, high wealth group. And they were really only different from each other on two of our outcome variables, which was importance of democracy and support for strongman rule. But generally speaking, we can see that these two profiles was trending in a way that lower education, lower wealth profiles tended to be more anti-democracy and pro-violence. And the higher education, higher wealth profiles tended to be more anti-democracy. Wait, what did I say? Pro-democracy, anti-violence. And so, of course, we don't have our sort of problem profile emerge in this particular sample of young present-oriented people. And our primary reason for this was because we used a different sampling method in wave 2. In wave 1, we oversampled youth because, we were particularly interested in youth. In wave 2, we didn't have the funds to do that. So we had to go for a representative sample. And because of this, we probably didn't have enough young people to sort of define these two differentiated groups of young adults. So we might have to reconsider this in future waves if we're able to access some additional funding. And sorry, I know I've talked for a while now, but I'm just going to really quickly sum up. One of the primary take-homes from research that we can sort of interpret is that present-oriented individuals do seem to be particularly unique and maybe particularly vulnerable to extremist narratives that promise immediate solutions to perceived threats. And we can see this in a lot of populist narratives and conspiracy theories, right? Like they really seem to emphasize this sense of urgency and impending doom. And this might be particularly appealing and persuading to people who already prefer to think about the short-term future. And counter messaging to the extent that is useful or practical could maybe focus on emphasizing the immediate practical benefits of democratic political engagement and nonviolent solutions. And something that I'm particularly interested in the future is whether or not present-oriented people are more conspiratorial in general, or whether like certain conspiracies are more appealing to present-oriented versus future-oriented people. However, we also showed that present orientation decreased over 1 year without any intervention, right? And this could be because present orientation tends to decrease with age, but we also showed that reduced present orientation is linked to increases in support for some democratic ideals. So we could develop interventions to promote future thinking to capitalize on this and see if we can sort of protect against, escalation to violent extremism via increased support for democratic ideals. But of course, we did not show that changes in present orientation were directly linked to changes in authoritarianism or support for political violence. So a little bit more work needs to be done here to figure out how best to use this relationship. And of course, we saw in wave 2 that future-oriented individuals can also be vulnerable. And it may not always protect against extremist thinking. So additional research is needed to explore the pathways from future orientation to violent extremism. And future-oriented individuals may be particularly persuaded by the long-term benefits of extremism. And so to protect against this, maybe we could focus on highlighting the sort of more impressive long-term benefits of democratic ideals and non-violent political engagement, and emphasizing the more extreme costs in the long term of authoritarian ideals and violent engagement. And then finally, this really seems to highlight the complex relationships and interrelationships of our social, temporal, and political characteristics. So social variables had these inconsistent effects both within and across waves. And we also showed that life transitions can influence support for authoritarianism as well. So together, these findings really seem to emphasize the idea that the influence of social variables is very context dependent, and there's no single pathway from any one demographic variable to political attitudes. And even though we found this really unexpected positive relationship between future orientation and authoritarian ideals in the wave 2 linear analyses, we didn't see this play out in the latent profile analyses, right? And so for me, this really sort of harks back to what Naomi was saying in her keynote on the first day about the difference between susceptible, vulnerable, and at-risk populations, right? And the things that may be associated linearly in the pooled sample might not be the things that we find implicated in the specific at-risk populations in sort of specific places. So in the future, we hope to continue this line of research. We've literally just finished collecting our wave 3 data. So you're welcome to stay in touch if you want to be updated about that. And we're really open to your thoughts or suggestions about where we could go with this next.
Thanks very much, Charlie. A very future-oriented person, as you can see by the final slide. And coming up to give our second talk is Susilo Wibisono, a future-oriented postdoc in our lab, also looking at the Queensland data and presenting on spatial, oh, thanks, Susilo. That's great. And presenting on a spatial analysis of similar variables.
Thanks very much, Winfred. Good day, everyone. My name is Susilo Wibisono. I'm from University of Queensland in Brisbane, and I'm going to present my research on spatial dynamic of radical action in Queensland. And we use the postcode-level analysis to map the distributions of the prevalence of radical behaviors across Queensland. But before that, so this is the part of presentation that I did in this forum last year. I did the network analysis to look at the interconnections between different causes and different tactics responded through conventional and radical action. So what we mean with the conventional is like simply normative, acceptable, lawful actions conducted by individual or group to respond the causes that they have concern with. And then radical action is considered as non-normative or non-violence, non-normative or unlawful, and sometimes it's also include physical violence. And there are some examples that we include in our survey, like blocking road, sit-in, locking onto infrastructure to stop or to slow work activities, and climbing trees, and displaying illegal messages in particular location, for example. So we consider those type of action as the radical actions according to the local law about this action. And there are many social issues that normally responded by using this type of action, and then we try to create the list of those issues, especially in the context of Queensland, from climate change, women's rights, animal rights, pro-LGBT rights, refugee rights, anti-immigration. So you might call it like the right-wing causes or left-wing causes, or progressive versus conservative issues. And there are so many labels that scholars normally use to put those causes into a basket to simplify them. As the follow-up of what we did last year, so we tried to create the spatial analysis or spatial dynamics. So it's like looking at how the geographical distribution might explain the different prevalence or the different level of intentions or the past experience of those tactics in Queensland. And then we use the postcode-level analysis because postcode is one of the indicators that government use to identify the particular locations, in addition to, for example, suburbs or electoral area. And then we use this postcode because we believe that postcode might provide granular insights into local patterns of collective actions, especially the radical actions in relation to its causes and different tactics. And we also recognize that Queensland is geographically diverse. So from metropolitan area across Brisbane or Gold Coast, and then the suburbs around these metropolitan cities, and also there are outback and remote areas across Queensland, and they not only represent the different geographical characteristics, but also different characteristics of people, different characteristics of socioeconomic situations, and maybe different characteristics of problems that they face. Theoretically, geography has been working with how people are influenced in their political tendency. I believe there are some talks about it yesterday, like the people living in remote area, they tend to be more right-wing than the people living close to metropolitan area. And then this is one of the attempts to test those theoretical views. So we conducted a survey in 2023. So it was conducted from October to November last year. And then we recruited, in total, it was actually 1,101 Queenslanders, but after doing some protocols of data cleaning, we have to exclude some participants and we end up with 1,026. But we also consider that there are some participants who made typo in their postcode and then we don't know where they actually come from. Like, for example, they type 5-digit of postcode, so it's impossible to have 5-digit postcode in Queensland. But I mean, one of the digit is like letter, not number. So we just like exclude these participants, and then we have like quite balance in relation to the gender identity, and then the age, the average of age is 49 years old with the standard deviation of 18 years, and then this is the example of the survey that we work with. So we identify their participation to support particular causes and also their past participation in using particular tactics to support the cause that they most engage. So the most important cause that they support in the last 1 year. And then we also use the statistical data from ABS. We focus on the three socioeconomic indicators, like the index of relative socioeconomic disadvantage, index of economic resources, index of education and occupation, because the idea about violent extremism or radical action is mostly associated with those economic variables. Like my belief that people from low level of economics, they tend to engage into violence than the people from high level of economy, as well as the education, for example. And then we try to use those statistical data to test the engagement in radical action. The list of different types of action, and then by using the categorization of conventional and radical actions, considering the local norms, and we also measure the intention, like how they intend to participate in these tactics, like to engage with these tactics to support the most important cause that they identify with. And then this is the operational definition of the socioeconomic variable that we use, like the index of relative socioeconomic advantage. Like the lower score indicates the areas of relative disadvantage compared to the area with higher score, and then the high score in the economic resources indicates that those areas, they have like greater access to economic resources. Unfortunately, the data was provided based on the suburb, so we had to try to use the average to look at the postcode level, because like one postcode can only contain one suburb, but there are so many postcodes that actually cover more than one suburbs. Oh, sorry. So, and then there is also the data, not only the raw data, but also the decile, like the 10 ranks of the category of those suburbs. And then we try to also use the decile value to double check the analysis conducted by using the raw scores. We tried to use the types of analysis for our purposes. So the first one, we tried to visualize the distribution of engagement in radical tactics and intentions to engage in radical tactics. And then we also use regression analysis to examine how these socioeconomic variables may predict the engagement and also the intention. There are, however, we have some problems with our data because we only covered 207 postcode from more than 3,000 postcode in Queensland. That's quite small. So that's the first problem. And then the other problem is that we have different numbers of participants within the postcode. So it's like there is in our data set that one postcode only contains 5 participants. Okay, one postcode only have 5 or 3 participants, and then those people, they engage in like radical tactics in the last year. So I don't want to say that 100% of people in this area engage in radical tactics in the last year. So we tried to use the Bayesian estimate to make justice on the postcode level by converting the raw data using the Bayesian estimate, and then we got the Bayesian estimate to represent the prevalence of each postcode. And then we just tried to look at which type of cows and which cows that have higher estimate and which tactic that have higher estimate at the postcode area. And then we tried to visualize them into a map. So this is the visualization for the causes. So as you can see here that the cows that have higher support across Queensland is more related to climate and animal rights based on the data that we collected, and then support for certain causes is localized in specific area. So the area close to metropolitan cities like Brisbane and Gold Coast is showed like greater support for climate change compared to the remote area. And then there are also different tactics that people engage for the conventional tactics. So the most popular tactic, as we see here, is the using petition, both online and offline petition. So this is the most popular tactics, but there is also some differences in relation to the most popular tactics. And then we tried to isolate our data set into the more radical tactics where blocking the road is the most popular one, but there is also some differences in particular area where they engage in like displaying illegal message or the message in illegal location, for example, like the bridge, the building, like normally see in the media. And then in relation to the intention, so yeah, in general, the intention to engage in radical action is considered as low, but there are some dot points that show they might have like a medium level of intentions compared to the others who have low level of intentions. Yeah, unfortunately, when we try to predict those radical action intentions by using the socioeconomic indicators that we take from ABS, there is no single economic variable that's significant to predict radical action intentions. And then we double check this analysis by using the decile of the index, and the result is consistent. So there is no socioeconomic indicators that significantly predict the intentions to engage in radical action. So in overall, different characteristics represented in different areas are linked to social issues collectively supported and the choice of collective tactics. So there might be different causes that can be used to mobilize people in different area, and there might be different tactics that can be that might have like higher support in different areas across Queensland. And I also recognize that that much larger data set is necessary to represent the areas, considering that our survey only include like quite limited people, considering the population of Queensland and the area of Queensland itself. And then beyond socioeconomic index, some other factors might be linked to collective action, especially the radical actions like environmental damage in the area or the impacts of particular policy in the area. That's all. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Susilo. And Emma, if you want to come and try and alt-tab to your presentation just while I'm introducing you. I won't even try to introduce Emma's extensive record, but she's a prof at Flinders Uni, and she might be known to many people in the room, but under a variety of different hats. So just recently, Emma was awarded a Future Fellowship, a very competitive and exciting academic opportunity. That's to study one area of research in another role, working with many people perhaps in the room in other areas. I guess for me, what impresses about Emma is her ability to combine really innovative theory pieces, like the Mobilize piece a couple of years ago, which is really the foundation of all our work since, about the broad array of predictors of collective action, and going through 27 different theoretical models and creating an integrative framework, and then testing it empirically with novel methodologies. I mean, it's exciting stuff. But since you only have 17 minutes, Emma, I thought I'd talk for 13 about how great you are. No, I'm just kidding. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Winifred. Look, I'm conscious that I'm the very last speaker of a 3-day session, which I think we can all agree has just been fabulous. So I want to thank the organisers for the opportunity to present. It's my first time attending AVIT, and look, I always learn so much from engaging with these practitioner and really fascinating interdisciplinary networks. In that context, I guess I wanted to anticipate that the approach that I take to some of these questions is slightly different. I also really hate lecterns because I'm so short. So I'm going to move this and stand here. But the title of my talk is really, I think, considering something that we haven't drawn on too much, but I think would be of interest to many people who are engaged at the pointy end of practice, which is how do interactions between authorities and protesters drive what we talk about as latent and overt radicalisation. And we're talking here about, we've been working on using agent-based models to simulate some of these kind of complex system dynamics. And so I wanted to start, now is this going to work? Turn it on, that's a good start. How do I turn it on? Oh, just use the laptop, that's all right. Sorry, it's a rookie error, isn't it? That's okay, I'll just use the laptop. Oh, brilliant. Thank you. So I wanted to start with this picture and explain that really what I want to talk to you about today, following on from the other two talks in this session, really builds on an analysis of radicalisation and other problems that I'll talk about in a moment through the lens of protest, people participating in social movements, or what we talk about as in social psychology as collective action. So if you are thinking that people seem to be protesting more and engaging in more of these movements than maybe used to be the case, you're not just imagining it, and there are plenty of credible analyses showing that people are mobilising more than they ever have at any point in human history. So as I said, from a social psychological approach, these people are taking what we talk about as collective action. That is efforts taken by large numbers of people who are defined by themselves and others as a group to solve collectively a problem they feel they have in common and which is perceived to arise from their relations with other groups. So this is quite a broad definition of a whole category of human behaviours. And what I think is really interesting and useful about this definition is that collective action is actually central to many of the strategic challenges facing liberal democracies. So when we talk about polarisation and, maybe a lack of social cohesion, one kind of really pointy end of that is when we see things like what happened in the UK over this most recent summer, but even here in Melbourne last week, where you get one group of people protesting for something like refugee rights or the rights of immigrant communities, and you get a group of people who maybe oppose that agenda and they face off, and that creates kind of social disorder. So that is obviously a really pointy end manifestation of polarisation, but they're taking collective action, right? Of course, a proportion of people who engage in collective action, as we've just been hearing, come to do so through more sort of violent or radical forms of action. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll come back to that. And of course, sometimes the collective action is itself the threat to liberal democracy, as we saw, for instance, with the Capitol insurrection a few years ago. So we don't really need to look too far to see all the ways in which collective action is relevant to our work. And I guess one sort of note of optimism that I like to offer here is that this is actually something we know a lot about. So in parallel with the increasing kind of prevalence of social movements, collective action, people agitating for change in these diverse ways, there's been this real kind of uptick and surge of research as well within, certainly within the psychology of collective action. And Winifred and I and others have sort of tried to bring a lot of that work together to provide a kind of a value add of, well, you know, there's a lot of factors here. How do we understand them? How do they interrelate? So as we've just been hearing as well with Charlie and Susilo's talk, really most of this research addresses two questions. So why do some people act while some don't? So this is a kind of the idea that, you know, a lot of people actually just remain deeply apathetic about many of the social issues in the world. And I actually don't think that we talk enough about that. I actually think one of the huge risks to democracy is apathy. And I don't hear people talking enough about that maybe. But I guess perhaps of relevance really to a lot of people in this room is, well, why do some people adopt more radical, that is illegal or violent tactics while other people don't? And in the literature on this topic, we draw on the distinction between conventional actions, things that are sort of lawful and political, versus radical actions, that is illegal or violent forms of behaviour. One real gap, I think, in this literature, and this is the gap that I want to talk more to today, is that, you know, these are people who are engaging in action through groups to bring about some sort of desired social change. And I think that many people, of course, referred to the programs that you all work in, also are seeking a social change of some sort. But this really takes time. And in that space of time, there's these repeated interactions between and within protest groups, with their adversaries, and perhaps especially with authorities. So we don't really understand that kind of that real temporal dimension to all of these things, as Charlie was also saying. But social change also involves change within and between entire populations. But not everyone, of course, responds to the same circumstances in the same way. And again, this is really well understood in the literatures that you've all been working in as well. So we talk about this idea of trajectories and routes and pathways rather than profiles and more static kind of things. So I guess we recognise theoretically these things are important, but they're actually really hard to engage empirically, of course, because when you put those two things together, you're talking about vast timescales and vast scales, and that's a very, very expensive piece of research, empirical research to resource. So the research questions that inform this work are, well, how do interactions between authorities and a movement shape tactical choices, and in particular people who come to radicalise? And we're really interested in the idea that maybe you're either failing at achieving your group's goals, or perhaps you're succeeding at group's goals. So by way of what I want to blast through in the remainder of my time today, I'm going to briefly introduce the theoretical model that really draws on this idea that when a movement or a group is struggling to achieve its aims, diverging trajectories will emerge. And that's one of those kind of contextual drivers of this kind of splintering, and one of the trajectories, of course, is radicalisation. I'll briefly present empirical data, which, again, you'll just have to take my word for it. And this work is in the public domain. This was work led by Winifred. But really the thing I want to show you today is we've then taken all of this, we've taken the theoretical model and the empirical estimates from that set of experiments, and we've simulated them in an agent-based model, because that allows you to get to the time and the scale in a way that, as I said, is very difficult to get to. And they're very adept at handling these kind of complex systems approaches to these dynamics. So starting then with the theory, the theory here is that when a group is succeeding, of course, if your group is succeeding in achieving its goals, then that will reinforce the tactics that you're using. So if you're using conventional tactics, or your group is using conventional tactics, then you will continue to use those because that's working for you. However, when you're struggling to achieve your goals, and of course, this is a subjective perception that individuals have, but also is something that groups kind of regulate and agree upon as a kind of a norm or a status for their group, then diverging trajectories will emerge from participants in the group. So on the one hand, you can imagine things getting tough. Maybe you really support a particular version of social change, but you're just getting nowhere. And maybe you just go, well, do you know what? This isn't worth my time. Some people disidentify and they exit. They just walk away and go and do something else with their time. Other people would say, well, look, maybe we just need to do more of the same, harder, faster. So, you know, you energize around conventional tactics. But I guess key here is that one group, though, may be of the mind that if what you're doing isn't working to engage change in the way that you're looking for, then maybe the thing to do is to try new tactics. And that can be part of a radicalisation process. And again, we know from probably the work of the people in the room and like a long-standing finding within the terrorism literature is that political violence is often strategic and people use it because they see it as a meaningful way to try and bring about change. So these are 3 different trajectories. Of course, the people who are doing the disengagement piece are not the people who are radicalising, and the people who are doubling down on conventional tactics in our theorising weren't the people who are becoming radicalised, but actually we have an update on that as well that I can share in question time. But so that was the theoretical idea, and we set out and we test that basic kind of theoretical idea in a whole bunch of experiments. So we invited participants into the virtual laboratory. Participants were invited to think that either they had engaged in conventional action or radical action, and that action had either succeeded or failed. So we had 4 experimental conditions, different groups of people, and we did this across a raft of at least 9 different issues that kind of spanned a kind of ideological range in terms of environment. We had immigration for and against immigration, abortion for and against. We had Irish, American, and Australian samples. This is the meta-analysis that we reported of those 9 tests. So don't freak out and think that I'm going to ask you to read those numbers. And again, this was work led by Winifred that we published in 2022. But basically what we show is, yes, people who are experiencing failure are more likely to disidentify. People who are experiencing failure of their conventional tactics are more likely to want to innovate, which is try new things, including more radical things. And people who are experiencing failure are more likely to endorse radical tactics. So this gave us some kind of broad support for the tenets that we had started to develop within the DIE model. But it doesn't get to the time and scale bit. And as I said, that's what we really wanted to look at. And, you know, how do these things feed in over themselves? If you can picture again the theoretical model I showed you before, it had a lot of feedback loops. People don't just engage once, they take that as a form of feedback and then they engage again and again. So we simulated all of those parameters in an empirically formed agent-based model. And so an agent-based model is where you basically create an artificial society. And they're really well suited to simulating these complex systems that I know some of the sessions have been starting to talk about as well. So this idea that you've got individuals nested within groups, nested within communities, and how do you understand the complexity of those flows? Well, agent-based models are a really useful way of doing that. And again, this is an approach we can import from public health kind of approaches. So this is how we manage, for instance, the COVID outbreak. So this is a set of modelling processes that are very widely used within public health. So the agents can represent individuals, groups, organisations, and you can attribute characteristics to each of those agents. And as I said, they're really useful where time and scale are hard to reproduce in the lab. So we developed a lab, agent-based model. We had this population of agents that we programmed with characteristics that we knew existed within the populations based on our meta-analysis. So we attributed, each agent got attributed a value around identification and innovation and all those ideas I was talking to you about before. And they were normally distributed around the kind of population that we know existed from our data anyway. They were also attributed with kind of proclivities towards acting radically and using conventional forms of action. And then because we knew from our experiments the kinds of effect that usually has on a person's psychological responses, we were able to program in the back end the updating that happens each time you experience a success, that is a signal from an authority saying your group is succeeding in some way, or a failure. And we simulated these effects over 10,000 iterations and at different probabilities of failure over time. So what this allows you to do is to look at thresholds at which a particular maybe point of failure becomes really important for understanding radicalism. That's the maths. Please don't ask me to explain it. So the maths was developed by my colleague Ben Ye, and but there was all this quite gnarly mathematics in the back end. As I said, this is essentially a graphic of what we implemented in the model. So an authority sends a signal saying the group is succeeding or failing. The agents were endowed with properties. And what happens is once they'd received that signal, the agents first decided whether to act or not, and that was the first sort of decision tree. And if they were going to act, whether they were acting conventionally or acting radically. And the act or not thing was a nice thing because it allowed us to also codify people who maybe were giving up on acting in this iteration, but had last used radical tactics. And that becomes important when I show you what the findings are. There was also another layer here, which is that, and again, I don't have heaps of time to go into this, so I'm going to gloss over this and happy to talk about it, but collective actors frequently contest failure. We would all know ourselves, anyone who's engaged with any kind of grant writing or other process knows that when you fail, you initially think, ugh, but then you go, it's all right, it wasn't a failure because I learned X, Y, and Z. And so we know that cognitively people contest failure, and this is a really important part, of course, of how we maintain motivation. But people also collectively contest failure, and this is a really important thing that we know people do within social movements as well. So in addition to the original parameters we had, we also allowed a more psychologically valid, realistic account of how the agents worked. Okay, another freaky looking slide, but let me talk to you about this. So we basically found across all of those parameters, 2 emergent states kind of emerged across all of those parameters. So on the left is basically what the society looked like when you have a responsive authority with high levels of success, you have high capacity to contest failure, which again, if you think about it, is more likely when you have some level of kind of social contract or trust between yourself and the state. And what you see there is basically you see most of the population have disengaged, but the people that and you've got around a sort of 40% group who are latent conventional. So people care, they're sympathetic towards the movement, but they're not acting conventionally. And if they did act, they would act in a way that is conventional. So really this kind of models probably a well-functioning democracy. On the right, where you've got very high levels of state failure and an incapacity to contest failure, because it's like you can't contest the failure. And again, you can think about really repressive contexts where you either don't talk about it with people because you could go to jail, or, you know, there's not a contract between yourself and the state in a repressive regime. Basically, our simulations revealed that a huge proportion of the population, 80% of the population, became attitudinally radicalized, prepared to use violence, but they were inactive. So they were at home in their houses because going out wasn't worthwhile. However, if they were to come out, they would protest again using very violent means. So essentially what we think we identified here is the precursor state to kind of violent revolution that comes from repression. This is a heat map of the different combinations, and really the point of this slide is to say latent radicalism emerges from a combination of factors. So it's repeated failure that can't be contested, and even high levels of failure, so even high levels of pushback for a state or an authority, do not produce attitudinal radicalisation if they can be contested because there's some level of engagement and social contract. And I think this is a very important message too. Okay, so take-home messages. To me, collective action is central to many of the strategic challenges facing liberal democracies, and I could give probably a whole week's worth of talking about various other pieces of work that we've done that really sort of maybe help us to understand some of those things, and that's work I engage with through Defence and some of our colleagues in the NIC. Repeated movement failure and repression is a path to mass latent radicalisation, and it seems to set the stage for violent revolutionary change. But the reverse is also true, that conventional action dominates when the political process can at least be perceived to be successful. And I think that's a really important message there as well. Michelle spoke, I think it was yesterday or the day before, about, you know, this observation that in order to stave off the threat to democracy, many governments are implementing increasingly harsh authoritarian measures, which if you sort of take this at face value actually could be creating the problem that you are trying to address. And I think that that's a really important message. So harsh, overly punitive policing and legal reforms that make conventional forms of protest impossible actually only leave one other thing, and that might not be something we want to think about either. And in that context, the psychological contract between participants in a movement and the authority really substantially buffers latent and overt radicalisation. And then a final methods piece, and I really enjoyed Matteo and other people's talks as well, and Charlie mentioned this as well, you know, using these really person-centred approaches that allow us to model non-linearity, complexity, and I think agent-based models are in this as well, that they can provide tools to examine counterfactuals, which I know is a real issue from a practitioner point of view. I can turn up, give you a long shopping list of things that matter, but if you're at the coalface of making decisions about how to intervene with how much force, you know, what do you let go, then you need if-thens, and I think these kinds of modelling approaches are very, potentially very useful in that way. So shout out to my brilliant collaborators, and as I said, Winifred was involved in all of this work. And then coming up, Winifred very briefly mentioned this, so we want to continue doing this line of work. Winifred and I and some of the colleagues have got one of the ONI funded grants looking at how specific kind of dynamics play around conspiracy-based movements. And as Winifred mentioned, I've been awarded a future fellowship and I'm looking for a postdoc to help me look at unravelling the psychological foundations of what I talk about as reactionary social movements. But many of these social movements are conspiracy-based, illiberal. You get the gist. So if anyone knows anyone, please send them my way. That's my email address, and that's a QR code to link to the paper. So the agent-based model is in prep, but that is the preprint if anyone's interested.
Thanks so much. Before we get to our question period, I'm just going to take advantage of my position to give a bit of a little reflection on how I see the three papers fitting together in the work of our lab and our collaborative network, because of course Emma leads her own lab. So let's see if this works. It has been quite treacherous. Session host. Thank you. Can you make it go back? Sorry. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, Okay, great. Thank you. And since I'm only talking for 2 minutes, you may think I didn't need a PowerPoint, but I am an academic, so I put that in. So firstly, as Emma highlighted, as so many people have highlighted, a lot of us are grappling with how to both theorize and empirically analyze systemic forces. And so with Susilo and a couple of others, I've written a book forthcoming from Cambridge Uni Press called The Psychology of Social Change, which is really trying to understand how those human decision makers in systems can grapple with these forces. And in the lab, what we're trying to do is look at social decision makers who are often collective decision makers that are in specific environmental places, specific places built by humans in natural environments at a point in time, who are evolving and who are contesting and who are innovating. And so when you try and do that empirically, as you can tell through the presentations today, sometimes you have to kind of choose and go in, you know, one person's doing a spatial analysis, another person's looking temporally, and through the brilliant work of Emma and the team trying to do that agent-based modeling over time. But we all share a commitment to a dynamic systems approach, and that has several elements that I think are worth highlighting. Firstly, it looks at not just elements, but relationships, and conceives that grievance-based actors who might become violent extremists are interacting with state-based actors. A lot of the research kind of keeps the state out of the lens, which is a simplification for analytic purposes. But we're in the lens, we're part of the lens. So that's really important. And the other aspect is that in the empirical data collection, it's so patchy. So many people have talked about this today. You have the people that are caught and convicted, and you have a long queue of researchers trying to study people in prisons, whether in Australia or in Indonesia, like my student Shafiq, in the important work we saw yesterday. But then we have people out in the community, and as Susilo highlighted, we can do what's for us a very big sample. 1,000 people is big for us, and then we find this is way too small to look at, for example, postcodes, where there's 3,000 postcodes in Queensland alone. So we have problems where we need to oversample youth. We need to oversample regions. And we also need to face the analytic complexities. I don't know how many people noticed that last year, Susilo came up with a whole new analysis around network analysis that was really innovative and fresh. This year, he's come up with another totally new analytic approach using Bayesian methods. It's not trivial in terms of how hard it is, and yet it's not sufficient. So we're struggling with that. We welcome your input. And then the question of the instability over time that Charlie highlighted. You know, sometimes it's noise, sometimes it's a trend, and sometimes it's a moderation or an interaction like Naomi's been highlighting in her important work and theorizing over many years now. So that's one issue. For me, the most important and exciting aspect of the work we showed is in Emma's work on latent radicalization. You know, when we study the people that are acting and we ignore the people that are not acting, when we focus on the violent act, but we haven't theorized that before and after the violent action, the part when they're in their house, angry and waiting to come out, you know, I feel like we need to do a better job as social psychologists of engaging that. And I'm not sure whether in other fields we're missing something. I feel like it is missing from the broader literature. The other aspect is the eroding feedback loop that Noemi mentioned. And, you know, when we see that there are lots of facilitating factors that strengthen our democracy that we perceive are eroding over time. And lots of us have talked about that analytically, but I think we can demonstrate it empirically. And when we use the systems science, we can start to think about those two factors in combination. Eroding feedback loops that support democracy, increasing facilitating factors that are promoting intransigence, disrespect, and violence, and a population that is disengaged, but should not be understood as happy, that is silent, but is mistrusting, that is silent, that is contemptuous and disrespectful. We need to do more with those, the Tinder populations and the spark events, as I was thinking. So that's my riffing. I look forward to you saying, I've already solved this problem, and here's the paper that I wrote it up in. Okay. Back to being a chair. I'm a chair, and I'm saying we have 16 quality minutes to solve social change. Yes.
No surprise, I love everything that the lab is doing.
Thank you so much.
I haven't solved the problem.
Okay, right.
I do agree. My work has completely shifted to looking at the people who are not acting, because I think the real harm comes from all the people who are not acting. And I'm not so concerned. I mean, obviously, I am concerned because they are killing people sometimes. And obviously, I'm concerned about that. But I think actually law enforcement has a pretty good handle on that. So I feel as a social scientist, my contribution is mostly elsewhere. As I just wanted to have a little input as someone who has worked with surveys and geographical units of analysis and oversampling. So when we did our ecological survey, we had to send, and it was a postal survey.
Yeah.
The difference with yours is that we're not asking people to report on themselves, although obviously we have control variables about, who are you and so on. We are using them as CCTV cameras. So we're asking, when you look outside the window in your street, what do you see? And that's how we capture the ecology. Because as I said, we're more interested about what's going on around the people who are doing stuff than and so on. But in terms of oversampling, to give you an idea, we had to send 20,000 surveys to get 1,000 responses. Yeah. And that was what was expected. Because we're using them as CCTV cameras, it doesn't matter to us that we get the greatest number of responses. It matters that we cover the whole geographical area. So when we oversample, we don't oversample types of people like young people or something. We oversample a postcode and we keep sending until we get enough responses from that postcode. But just to say that when you do this sort of, the effort is intense, and obviously the funding needs to be proportionate.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more with that, especially that last clause. Did everyone hear that? Thank you so much. Other comments and questions? Michelle?
I have a question for Susilo. Illegal actions, Thank you. Illegal actions, I understand in your model, but I was really intrigued by what you meant by illegal messages.
Why don't you come to them? Oh, good on you, Susilo. Yeah.
Do you mean the displaying the illegal message?
Yeah. So so how are you defining an illegal message? What constitutes an illegal
the
message?
message is actually like self-report, but what we think about the illegal message is actually like displaying message in the illegal places, like in the bridge,
Graffiti.
building.
Oh, so like hanging something off a bridge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And graffiti and so on.
Okay. So it's the display part, not the content of the message.
Yes.
That's right. Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
At the back. Oh, Matteo. Great.
Thank you. I loved all the papers, actually. Thank you to all the presenters, Winifred. I have a question for Emma because I'm part of a team who presented another agent-based model in this conference, and I'm wrestling with some of the issues behind the calibration. So I understand you used experiments you run yourself, as we did, and meta-analysis data. But when we calibrate a model based on that data, is the model replicating the samples that informed the empirical studies? What's the external validity of that model? I wonder. I know it's a tough question. I wonder if you have any ideas.
It's a great question. Yeah, and so I'm not a agent-based modeling expert, so I'm going to put that little caveat around anything I say. I mean, I think you always have to have an eye to the sample that you're modeling, and because our estimates were based off this meta-analysis, so I think you can draw conclusions about the outcomes based on whatever you've parameterized. That I struggle with that word. I don't know. However you've parameterized your agents is what you can infer from them. And because we had attributed all our agents started with a mean of, the different attributes of, the 7 sort of dime variables. And then that was normally distributed around, based on a mean. They were based off the standard deviation around the mean. So we created a population that we tried to make look as much like the people in the wild. Of course, you're missing, you could program with 100 other variables, but then I'm told the maths gets really nasty. So we just started with endowing them with 7 different attributes related to the things that we were going to model. So in that sense, it captures the people in the wild, but on those 7 dimensions, of course, we're not all reducible to 7 dimensions. So that's the kicker, I think. But what I would love to do is keep building the model over time, making it more and more complicated and therefore more and more realistic. So the more you build into the model, I think, again, I gather from my colleague Ben that the maths really will break him at some point if I keep going, can we also do this? But that's what I would love to keep doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of the stuff around the state responses, you can't have helped but notice the incredible simplicity of the binary success failure response. And Em and I have talked a lot with Ben and Simon, and they see a lot of potential to elaborate that. And we're kind of really interested in that, both in terms of nefarious state responses and in terms of more direct engagement. So many of you would know the line of work of, is it Michael Plato or Michael Wenzel on providing the illusion of voice, where governments essentially, it's a consultation response. So if you go into the group and you allow them to consult, there's an immediate reaction of feeling like there's greater procedural fairness. But what this kind of modeling allows us to do is look at how that plays out over time as the group is noticing, as many groups have noticed, that consultation is no longer received as well as it used to be. So, looking at a range of state and protester choices is a very exciting direction of Emma's work, I think. So people are starting to rustle, but I see we've got 7 minutes, so I'm just going to keep going. Yeah, and behind Noemi, there's another one after this. Yeah.
No, it's just a comment, having also used agent-based modeling. I mean, my students have used it to test bits of my work because I'm like you. I was like, yeah, that sounds great. Yeah,
Yeah.
let's do that. Yeah, you go for it. It's to my understanding, it's only after that you really validate the ecological, because you come to some conclusions about, okay, then if the model is right, then this intervention should have this effect. And then you test that. And that's the only way that so it's only at a much later stage that you're able to draw any conclusion. You may have invested a whole lot of work and complicated math into, but there isn't really, to my understanding, no other way to really come to some conclusion about the ecological validity.
I think so, yeah. And you see that as well. And that is, I guess, another useful way. So I've seen agent-based models also used for, I guess, hypothesis generation. You create a whole bunch of circumstances and agents with particular properties, you throw them into a model, look at what happens, and then you test to see if that is what happens. So I look forward to the test, though, where people do 10,000 iterations of failure. So that's the issue in a way.
Well, that's academia, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that is. That's my grant writing life.
For me, the most useful way that my students have used it is to test my predictions.
Yeah.
Because in the systemic theory, you can't test it. It's too big. You know, I would need data on everything everywhere all at once. It's just not possible. Yeah. So for me, that's the most useful part.
Yeah, brilliant.
I had two quite different questions, if that's okay. The first one was for Charlie. Very fascinating, the difference between your two sort of phases of sampling. How much do you think is down to sampling differences, or how much is down to actually things that happened maybe in the environment between the two samples?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm only the final person in a long line of people who have struggled with the tech this symposium. A really great question. We do know that the samples from time 1 to time 2 were, the people who returned for the Wave 2 survey were significantly different from the ones who dropped out in terms of a bunch of variables. But we measured, it's a really long survey. We had I don't know, maybe 200 different variables in it. So I've only compared the two samples on my PhD variables, and I should have done that before coming to Overt, but I didn't look for differences on the variables we included in these analyses. But from time 1 to time 2, we do know that the time 2 sample was much less radical in terms of climate action intention, so unrelated, but still a less radical sample, and that the people who returned tended to be older. So the young people who were signing up for our participant recruitment platform, potentially they were doing it to get some quick cash at the time, and then they forgot about it and dropped out. And so we don't have that really important group of people. And so I'm certain that that has had some impact on our differences between Wave 1 and Wave 2. And yes, also I am certain that some events that were going on in Australia and the world had an impact, but I've had no time or way of sort of considering those yet, unfortunately.
Yeah, and we do have Wave 3, right? So we collect the data in September, October. I believe the increase in support for police violence is related to perhaps that timing. But what we'll see with the 2024 data is how people are responding now. So I believe that in Queensland, there should be change across a number of variables that's related not to the sampling, but to the context.
Thank you.
Mark.
Can I, just a second?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Sorry. With the modeling, I mean, I know it would just greatly complicate it, but it'd be great to have a second variable in there, which would be societal kind of, I guess, response, not just authorities' response to the actions.
What do you mean by a societal response?
So, for example, we'll see when, we saw it here with land forces, when protesters started to attack horses, suddenly the societal response to that type of protest activity is almost like a self-moderating factor around those groups. So I'd be really interested in how that plays into your modelling.
What an interesting question.
Yeah, the context, and also an adversary. You've got another group often who are mobilising around the opposite change to the one you seek, and then all of that is playing out in the context of people who maybe haven't made a decision. And we know, and we've got some work on this as well, that we know that using more extreme methods, generally is off-putting for most bystanders. And so, you would expect that would pull people towards another way. Yeah, no, I think it's a really great idea.
And Mark?
My question is just looking at the other side of this was what type of behavior by government gets rewarded by community.
Yes, interesting.
Whether or not
That's where empty consultation.
governments are rewarded for control, not for giving license. And I'm just wondering if that's something, how you factor that into what your, Emma, you might want to.
I don't know. Did you want to? Yeah. Oh, I have a view because I always have a view. Look, I think this is exactly why agent-based models are a potentially useful tool in the toolkit for government. I gave this same talk actually to a person in the room was in charge of policing protests in France. So you can imagine what his day job looks like because, of course, they're a very mobilised population. And he was like, look, you can't, it's not politically possible for us to be hands-off, which is, you know, one reading of my message, which probably isn't the message either. So you can't afford to be an authority that doesn't engage, nor though can you afford to be an authority that is engaging in a way that is repressive. So the answer is in the shades of grey in the middle, and that is where, so if you probably don't remember it, in one of the hideously complex figures I flashed up was the green with the heat map.
Yeah.
In that heat map is some sweet spot that maximises the payoff on both. Like it's not too damaging on that way, but it's not too damaging on that way. And so that's a mealy mouthed answer because obviously I don't know the answer, but I do think that these kinds of methods can really help you and other authorities make those sort of decisions.
Yeah. I don't know if we have time for one more question or whether you guys would just like to flee the room. Everyone's avoiding eye contact and I'm seeing some people fidgeting. So will you join me, please, in thanking our brilliant speakers? And I also want to echo the thanks of Emma and everyone else I'm sure in the room. Michelle, this has just been another brilliant conference. I've really enjoyed all the sessions I've been to, and the other speakers who are here, thanks for your great work as well. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and the actual people that did all the work, not just the figureheads. We thank you. We thank you, City. Thank you.
Look at you, professional. Okay, yeah. I love that. Finally. Do my job for me. Yeah, thank you. Oh no. So I can't. Someone's deleted my holding slides. The whole folder. Oh. Of me? There they are. Okay. Restore. Cheeky. No wonder you couldn't find that. Oh, it's empty. Yeah. No. Okay. Oh my God. Let me run and get. I've got a USB. Hold on. That's it. Another handful. Yeah. Of course. Should I pull up the talk? Just should that be easier?
Yeah. Oh, we also got
And we just make go up. If you have a because the way government works is a program, you do research, you present, you've got to have this, if someone says they don't like it, you've got to know what they're so we don't really and then you get over it. And they're really all about
yes, please. Thank you.
how you actually get
Yeah, there's some political journalism there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Like, we want to do that.
we know
And we
best.
just
So how do we get people to go there?
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what did you find?
Well, we came up with a number of things which Pascal, you signed it. We want to be involved in the process of policy for our and so I suppose we came up with some things which there are some things governments would do simply to make that genuine. One of the things is, for instance,
what should I behave? For publication purposes.
Like however you want. Yes, stop teaching you that you don't feel like students just administering take headway with someone and they move on. It's quite a pernicious thing. Yeah, I'll keep an eye out. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Holly. So do I just stand like this?
Thank you.
To our last session. So just appreciate if everyone can just settle back in the room. We want to get you out here on time. So can I just ask that, because we're going to do the last session slightly differently today. If you're not sitting at a full table, can you just take a little bit of time to consolidate? So if you can just take up, so if the twos or the ones and stuff come together, come. Sit, be with each other. That's it. Gather. I'll give you a second to organize yourselves. All right, everybody sorted? Come on, you two, get into a bigger table. Otherwise, you're going to be talking to yourselves. All right, that's better. First of all, you guys are the A+ crew, the good students who've stayed to all the way to the end. Well done. So for the plenary reflection session, I thought we would just do it a little bit differently, where at the end of a really long 3 days, we've absorbed so much information. So we'll just do it a little bit more casual for the end. I wanted to, in this reflection, throw like a couple of questions at you for you and your groups to discuss amongst yourselves. We'll give you 10 minutes to go through those questions. And then I might go and kind of call on a couple of the tables to offer us a reflection of what you have come up with in your small group discussions. So maybe you want to assign one person to be your table spokesperson. You don't have to, but maybe that might be comfortable for some groups. And the questions that I want to throw to you are, we'll do them, there's 3 questions I want to throw to you. Is there a question about the topic under discussion today or what we've gone over that you still have? Did you come into the symposium with a question in your mind that you still haven't gotten answered? Or is there a new question or a new concern that's come up for you in these 3 days of amazing presentations and displays of research and practitioner knowledge? The second question I want to throw to you is, have you changed your mind about anything? Or alternatively, is there something that you kind of intuitively knew or believed or have seen evidence of in your work that has been confirmed for you either by the presentations and the research evidence that's been presented? And the last question is, did you learn about a new practice or an idea or a bit of research that you might want to adopt? Everybody got those 3? I'll write them down for you, or I might actually even put it up in a slide while you're talking. Okay, so I'll give you 10 minutes, talk amongst yourselves, have a little bit of a think about it, and I'll come back to you, okay?
Sorry. This is nothing. Or like, do I?
Subtrin. I have a question for you. I just want to put the questions up there. Do you know how to get it on the?
You want to flash?
Yeah.
I wonder if
Which is what I mean by what's the power by the right it does feel like I think in the context of like like I definitely like empathize with yes, and not knowing where you take on specific words.
on the wall. See how he gets his whole thing is the narrative that are basically yes. Yeah. And it's very good.
You are a model for you are a model, and because like was the point of organization is why shut out. I think you can have racism is bad. I just it's almost like I did.
Nice. Perfect. Thank you so much. I just took my name for the night return.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Or with the police to be a while.
I'd say it's really good. Yeah, that's all they speak.
And then look at me as well.
It's so much.
No, she did it. I really, it's so good. I'm coffee coats. I really
I just been to see.
All right, everybody. I know you're still talking lots amongst yourselves, which is a great sign to hear, but just for the interest of time, we might kind of bring us all back together. So is there a table that I'd like to volunteer, or shall I call? Volunteers? Yay. Okay, good. One over there. So, Derek.
Okay, so full disclaimer, we didn't really answer your questions. But
no one ever listens to me anyway. It's all good.
But your questions inspired the conversation. So something that we talked about, I guess, in terms of the questions, like things that we came to the symposium with and questions that emerged, was this idea of how do we break down silos? And there was a lot of interesting conversations on the different panels. And we sort of talked about this on two levels, like how do we move beyond criminology doing criminology work, psychology doing psychology work? But we also said that in some ways we're siloed of academics are doing academic things and practitioners are doing practitioner things. And we had a really interesting conversation about the bureaucracy and the bureaucratic processes of even something like getting grant funding and how sometimes government agencies want to give money and academics want to take money, but that process is so complicated that by the time it's resolved,
You're going to have to make me spell bureaucracy.
We've moved on. Sorry. But in essence, we've proposed 3 potential solutions to the problem because we're solution oriented at this table.
Right.
One is we think that there could be opportunities for fellowships that really expand beyond our traditional use of fellowships to allow for more innovation to occur and to allow for a space for the non-conventional research. Because we had a great conversation of at the postdoc level and HDR level, students really are empowered to do this really innovative thinking. But then once we get to the academic spaces, we're kind of forced into these conventional areas. A second thing is we think it could be really interesting to explore opportunities for fellowships for practitioners of, I'm going to butcher this word, secondments, of being, we don't have that in America, so sorry. But things like that, to have these opportunities of, again, building these organic connections where we can. And then we talked a little bit about funding schemes of how, you know, the ARC process is painful and takes so long to go through. But where we might propose things like rapid response grants, where an agency can say, we really need something in 60 days or 30 days, and an academic can say, we can do it, and move beyond a lot of that administrative paperwork that would be tied to a multi-year, multi-million-dollar grants. And those are our solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Rapid evidence assessments and stuff. Okay, who's next? They set the bar high. What other table's gonna come up with their?
It's been thrown under the bus. No. So one of the questions, about what still hasn't been answered. I think we've had a lot of progress joining kind of practitioners and academia, as we can see by the fact that quite a lot of practitioners here. But to continue to work towards making the research more practical and more applicable, and kind of asking academics, like, how do you come up with your research questions, and how can it be informed by the needs of practitioners? So whether there's a way for academics to talk to practitioners, not just from their own state and territory, but nationally, so that there is a way of communicating the issues that we have. Because obviously everyone has really great ideas of what they're interested in, what they want to come up with, but we want to be adding to a pool of practicable research. And then in terms of ideas that we thought were great and would want to adopt, the idea of a curriculum program starting in preschool, or in parenting programs, to kind of start from such a young age, in an age appropriate way, start talking about these things, not necessarily about CVE specifically, but just about a lot of those concerning behaviours and how we can and that it's nationally driven and consistent. So it's not that the bigger jurisdictions get better resources and education from the ACT, you know. And what else have we got? Oh yeah, and then something also to adopt, definitely like learning from practitioners. So John Young just presented about the importance of like occupational therapy and things like that as an intervention. And that was really great to learn from other practitioners, but also having that general theories behind it. Like, we do this intervention and this is why, because it meets these needs, and it's not based in really specific research, but it's based on general sociological or psychological ideas and principles, which I think as a practitioner makes it a lot easier for me to understand and for me to be able to communicate that to my peers and things like that as well, and trying to create spaces for people that, you know, they can have emotion in socially acceptable ways, whether that's through art or different types of community engagements or horticulture and things like that. So how can we step into creative spaces to help people with their emotions too?
That's excellent. Thank you. So learning from practitioners, did you guys discuss like potential forums? Like, you know, we have Overt, which is fantastic, but are there other, you know, ways and means in which we can access and learn from practitioners? Maybe it's a question for another time or something to consider.
Well, I think we sort of we're thinking in terms of the not just forums, but even at Overt. And I'm not an academic, but you know, after the research, it would be really good to hear from the researcher as to why they picked that topic. Is it topical? And I do understand the time it takes to consolidate this type of research, but just to say this is why, this is how I think maybe it could be applicable, and just go one step forward about their research, because we hear a lot of data and a lot of things, but really, to be honest, the canary and the coal mine, thank you so much. That was really simplified, really clear, and actually gave me something to think about with a place as well, because you sometimes forget that as a practitioner. So kind of looking at that kind of application with I guess, with those types of research.
Mm-hmm. Yep, great, thank you.
I just wanted to say that we've been experimenting with a new seminar series format. I speak to the academics in the room, where we have, like, instead of a 1-hour session where an academic presents, we have a 90-minute session where there's an academic and a practitioner, and they both present on the same topic or on a related topic. So like social change, or, you know, poverty, or financial aspects of climate. And so each person speaks for 20 minutes in theory, and then each person responds for 5 minutes to the other person's talk. So it makes it kind of building in the dialogical aspect. And we've also tried the same with interdisciplinary, so a political scientist and a psychologist on the same topic. Mm-hmm. So the seminar series is dialogical, and I think it's been really well received. And because it's all online as well, practitioners find it easier to zoom in, whereas a seminar on campus, as you guys know, is not very accessible.
Lydia. That sounds great, having that, yeah, back and forth. Is this table ready?
Yeah. Hi, yeah. Lydia.
Hi.
Just on this particular topic, I mean, there is also the possibility of what I would call researcher practitioner speed dating in an online context. But I heard the point about saying not just in your not just researchers who live in state A or territory B and practitioners there. How do we make it national? And it could be done online, where you do have a sort of fairly focused and rapid but meaningful conversation with practitioners who say, this is what we need, these are the problems that we're facing, these are the challenges that we're looking to solve, and researchers saying, this is what we're thinking about, you know, and finding where those points of alignment are. And just to answer your question also about, are there other fora that we could sort of leverage for this person, for this purpose. I'm also a big believer in what I call the expression of interest mechanism. So where practitioners are able to sort of, you know, where we're able to compile almost a data set from practitioners who just list the topics, the challenges, the issues, the questions, right? You know, and that researchers can then come up with an expression of interest to say, I've got a project, a methodology, you know, an idea for how we might handle this. So I think exploring those mechanisms would be really good. Would you like me to also report back from our table now?
Yes, but I saw hand up. Is there, no? Okay, good. Yes, please. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay. So a couple of really terrific things that came out of the discussion here. I suppose in terms of a question that still hasn't been answered or a topic that could still be explored, there's a really fascinating point about saying, look, a lot of the people who end up in programs or have been identified as, on the pathway of radicalization to violence, they have skills. They're not just empty vessels. They can do things often. So I think that, an example was, a lot of facility online, perhaps with video gaming. What are the opportunities that we may be missing, was the question, in terms of redirecting some of the skills and capacities that are most at risk clients may have towards pro-social outcomes. Yeah. So here are these skills that are being used, in dark ways. How can we take those same skills and redirect them? And what kinds of program structure and also program funding would be needed to do that? Another point that was made is probably the need for more research around communities that face really, really complex issues and therefore complex vulnerabilities, perhaps, or susceptibilities, particularly when you're looking at the interaction between personal and environmental challenges and predispositions, but with the emphasis on complexity. A confirming point was the confirming what we've known, I think, for a long time, but the evidence continues, to say that radicalization is multifactorial, and that's worth, remembering when we're tempted to oversimplify things. And then the final thing, this was, I think, already come up from some of the previous tables, was how can we get better at bringing together academic researchers and government, even just in terms of knowing what the other is doing, what's happening, so a researcher who's interested in education, how do they know what education policies and programs around CVE are running in states and territories? And so this is partly about enriching our mutual knowledge base so that we can start to ask each other better questions. But it's also about not reinventing the wheel. Where a researcher might come up with a fantastic idea, or a practitioner might only to discover too late that somebody else is already doing it. So really, it's how can we be more open and transparent within, obviously some limits, so that we can create a broader knowledge base that we can share with each other.
Amazing, thank you.
As a quick sort of bounce off that.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's just come up in the past is industry involvement on PhD or research, so not as a full supervisor, but just to be brought in every now and then. And I think that's a strategy that works. And I think you could even scale that down. I think broadly speaking, practitioners are happy to be involved with stuff. You'll be fighting like a schedule and all that sort of thing, but always happy to be asked. And I think that's a really good way to participate and also develop relationships with early career researchers as they then go on to become career researchers. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Does that table want to keep going? Yeah.
Is that working? I don't know if we answered any of your questions, but we did talk about empathy and approaching people who are vulnerable to violent extremism with empathy and trying to understand the human motivations that put people in that place. And we had a bit of a chat around that we're getting better at talking about that with young people who are vulnerable to violent extremism, but we still really aren't there with adult offenders in terms of seeing them through that lens of what needs are they trying to meet, or what childhood trauma might they have had that's led them to be in a position where they choose violence. And then that kind of led to a discussion around labels and that the words that we use to describe offenders or pathologizing people's behaviors, or the units that we establish inside government to address the behaviors, are actually really important, because that kind of programs the way that we as practitioners or youth justice employees interact with clients. And so we were just talking about how important words are and labels, and that it's really nice that there's a trend towards having more empathy and trying to understand the human factors that put people in those positions. We talked about also the coal mine and the canary analogy, which seems to have resonated with lots of people over the last couple of days, and around the contextual environment around the individual person that finds themselves attracted to violent extremism. And what else do we talk about? Oh, ethics. We were saying it was an interesting theme that's come out through the couple of days around the importance of the principles and the ethics that we apply to our research methodologies and the people that we work with. Even if we're studying online environments, we have to really make sure that we're applying ethical principles to that research. Was there anything else? Oh, I also just wanted to chime in on the research and practitioner speed dating situation, and just put forward an idea. I'm sure you all know Malcolm Haddon, who often presents at Overt, and he has this great idea of practitioners kind of partnering with universities and some sort of funding arrangement where practitioners can go and undertake research in partnership with universities, which I think is a really nice way to do that, because there's such a wealth of expertise in people that practice in this space. And I think, as you were saying, we've got such busy schedules and it's really hard to take time out of that to kind of contribute effectively to research. So I think funding mechanisms that free up practitioners to go and then translate their knowledge into academic literature would be a really great mechanism as well.
So marrying it up with Jared's points about those secondments.
Yes, like an academic secondment for practitioners.
And would it work both ways?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Sure. Sorry, I was going to ask that. Yeah, please go.
We had the same conversation yesterday, but the other way around, about academics actually being able to come into institutions and be able to actually potentially do research there that is specifically related to that. So I think it definitely is a two-way street. Because I've got the microphone, I'm going to jump on that idea about that. I think one of the things that we've talked about in terms of the applying research and how there's a delay in terms of the results, and how, by the time we get them, that they don't actually, they're not there to inform policy anymore because we're already onto a new wicked problem. But I really liked yesterday that that discussion around, and the word yesterday was used, was snacks. That as researchers have, even when you don't have your finalised papers, that you feed into government or different agencies and provide those like snacks and tidbits about what you're seeing coming out, so that we can start to work on it prior to waiting for any kind of final formalised, literature that eventually we get, but tends to be a little bit late. I also think that we were talking about research applying to either policy or practice. And I think some of the things that I've been thinking about over the last couple of days has been, we talk a lot about the practitioner and we talk a lot about the academic, and we've been doing that for 3 days, but sometimes the different academics actually feed into different areas. So it would be really good for us to have a better idea about kind of when you're actually starting your academic work or you're starting a project, do you think this project is going to inform policy, or do you think this project is going to inform practice? And then we can link you in with the right people. And the last thing I was going to say is about labelling, which is also following on from what that table was discussing. But one of the things we said is, there any questions you still have or any answers? There's been a lot of discussion around labelling and appropriate CVE referrals, and I think that opening up our referral pathways and potentially our triaging and having a look at what we're doing. And we do it differently in every jurisdiction, but potentially having a look at the different overlay of which jurisdiction is doing it without potentially labelling people or putting them down a CVE pathway that is not necessarily CVE. And I think that we have an opportunity with some upcoming practitioner workshops and forums to actually have probably a national look at our referral pathways. And definitely a few things have come up in this symposium that have challenged some of the ways I think we're currently doing it.
Thanks, Kelly. Sure.
Yeah, Lydia, I just want to come back to the snack idea. So the question of being able to sort of phase or stage outcomes, so that there are a series of deliverables that can accelerate the usability of the research for policy. It's a really, really important thing. But I just want to also raise the reverse, and I actually do have a practical suggestion. I think one of the problems that we face as researchers that can also slow things down is actually getting access to data. And this is such a perpetual problem, or challenge in this space for reasons that but never mind a snack. I mean, we don't even get a peanut, right? By the time we put the request in, and this has happened to me, personally, and then 3 years later, when we're still waiting for the bowl of peanuts to arrive, and the research, has come and gone, and has been finished. So I think, but we do keep talking about this. Everybody agrees that it's an issue, and everybody also agrees, I think, that it's to the mutual benefit for the end users of the research, i.e. government, policymakers, practitioners, that we find ways around this. So a practical suggestion would be to set up effectively a data task force comprising academics and government to actually have a look at how we might identify and overcome, where possible, some of the barriers that currently exist to being able to get timely access to data, and then timely outputs in the form of snacks, that are going to be more effective for policy and practice.
Michelle, can I jump in? Sorry, Lydia, on this. We mentioned this in our table. I think I will take this further. I think that we need actually a national data infrastructure on focusing on CVE and extremism. So if I think about we all have bits and pieces of data that I have built a few databases. In this project, we're building another database. I don't know, Emma built another database and so on. How do we share it, first of all? And second, how do we create sharing with, I'm thinking, I work a lot with the Islamophobia register. They collect very important data. How do we build a infrastructure that allows us to share with different governance structures, of course, around different data sets, but can we build something, and can maybe Overt play a role in this?
Thanks, Matteo. So I'm mindful of letting you guys go on time. Are there any burning thoughts and questions? Or maybe not so burning thoughts and questions?
There was one, just from our table, there was one issue that was raised, for instance, that we talk a lot about youth at this symposium, and yet the question was raised about whether they'd be put into a box and that they were a subject to research rather than the research being done with them. I know that a lot of people are trying to change that, but that's a trend that needs to be focused on more. Is that one people said we needed a shared cognition about what issues were across researchers, NGOs, government and communities, so that we actually are all talking about the same thing in the same way. And it's not just between academics and government, but it's also broader than that.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark. Well, I think that that's a really significant way to end. We've gotten so many, look at how many pages that we've got. It seems your intellectual energy is still going, still firing after 3 days. So well done. Some of the things that were brought up are kind of, as you mentioned, Michelle, with the data thing, it's a perpetual issue. There's the timeliness of research, the applicability to policymakers and practitioners, because within the research community, there is applied research, but there's also basic research, and there's various interests as well. So I think there are some things that will be just kind of perpetual issues that we'll chip away at slowly, or we'll have to figure out ways to go around or to accept. But there's also some amazing ideas in there that we can certainly take away and reflect on and see how we can come together and do so. So I just want to close off. I'm not going to give really any major closing remarks, except to use my time to close the session just to say thank you. Thank you to everyone here who came and who participated and who was so engaged, especially for the people who lasted the 3 days. And just thank you to all of you, because you are the ones as presenters, as participants, particularly this year as we had the format, we had a few discussion sessions built in. You have added so much to this gathering. So thank you so, so much. Thank you as well to our special keynote, Professor Noemi Bahana. I mean, you see how much your ideas have resonated with everyone, especially in this final closing session where people are continually bringing up these ideas. Special thank you as well to Dr. Ghaida Hassan, who joined us online, who I know gave a really also impactful address that stayed with many of us in the room. It's been also great to see, new faces who've joined us for the first time and repeat offenders. We like recidivism in Overt, so that's really good. And also, I want to give a very special mention to the Symposium Organizing Committee, because you've seen, me up here a lot, you've seen our team, but prior to that, the work of the symposium actually begins at the start of the year, and it starts with the Symposium Organizing Committee. And so I'd like to name them one by one. Dr. Nell Bennett, who was our previous coordinator, spent a lot of time, I'm sure a lot of you have engaged with Nell, did a lot of work in the lead up to the symposium. Jared DeMello, who's also on our organizing team. Mark Duckworth, who's on our organizing committee. Michelle Grossman, Rochelle Hudson, Shane Slattery, who else? Carolyn Spiranovic, who unfortunately wasn't able to attend because of just some other mitigating circumstances. Haley Tran, Helen Young, Kate Mitchell, thank you very, very much to all of you. You guys put in so much work in the lead up to this symposium. So let's give them a round of applause. And also thank you to our chairs. You did the brief. You made this running smoothly. We didn't have any delays or barely any, or if we did and issues came up, you rolled with it. You made it happen. So thank you so much for all of that. To the Deacon Downtown team, to Jess and Georgina and all of her crew and all of the folks that looked after us in the building. You might not know them by name, but I'll say it anyway because these guys are like the best of the best. Eddie, Monty, Rudy, EJ, Mark, they really looked after us today. And last but not least, I told you they were the dream team, and they are the dream team. All of our volunteers, Estelle Ross, our coordinator, not only were they the dream team that actually kept this symposium going for those 3 days, all of them also presented and had their own research. So you can imagine that, like logistically trying to make this work and presenting. I didn't do it this year, but they're the dream team and they were able to do it. So big, big round of applause to them. Thank you. And so as for me, I hope that you guys will take a lot away from this, but also get a chance to kind of have a breather, relax. It's Halloween. I'm going off to go trick-or-treating now, to go do something totally different. I hope you will too. And if you don't, we've left out some treats for you out front as well. So thank you, everybody. Thanks so much.
Sorry, Lydia. Can
Yes.
I also just, as people are falling out, the one person, of course, that we haven't thanked is Lydia Khalil, the convener.
Thanks, Michelle. All right, you are released. Thanks. It's done. It's done.